So let me introduce Steve Francia. He's best known for leadership roles across several industry-defining projects: the Go language, Google's cloud native programming language, MongoDB, the NoSQL database, Docker, the container engine, and Drupal, the CMS powering 10% of the commercial internet. He also authored Google's open source strategy and led Google Cloud Developer Strategy. Among other popular open source projects, Steve created Hugo, which is the reason that everyone is here today. He's a published author, speaker, developer, and father of 4. Outside of tech, Steve likes skateboarding, photography, travel, music, and dystopian films. It's an honor to have Steve join us today, and I'm personally very excited to delve into how Hugo came to be. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Yeah, really excited to do this. And thanks for joining us. So I want to start at the beginning. Where did you grow up, and how did you get into software development?
Oh, that's really the beginning. Okay. So I grew up in Wilton, Connecticut, which is the same town I currently live in. I like growing up there so much, I figured I'd raise my children there. It's a town in the southwestern tip of Connecticut that's a suburb of New York City. So most people there work in New York City, and it's a big commuter town. And I grew up, let's see, where did I start programming? It's interesting. I remember I got into computers in my early teens, and I remember thinking that I had missed it all.
Yeah.
I looked at things like, all the work that Apple and Microsoft were doing on operating systems, and I thought the entire innovative space had happened before I was the right age to participate in it. Little did I know that the internet was in its infancy, about to be born. And I was able to, just fantastic timing, being a part of the dawn of really obviously the foundation of the internet started before them, but really the consumer internet that we've come to know and really branched out to become what it was started around that time. This is the early to mid 90s. And so I was fortunate enough to get a job at an early ISP. For those who weren't alive or around then, that's an internet service provider. And this is back in the days of mostly dial-up. And so there I learned a lot. I actually ended up becoming their lead Unix administrator. So started my career in operations and realized that the better I could program, the better I could do that job. And the more I learned about programming, the more I wanted to be a programmer rather than an operator. And
yeah. What languages were you using in that job?
It was at that time primarily C and Perl. There weren't many other languages that were, like Java was very nascent at that time. Most of the other open source languages weren't known yet. So I guess Bash, a lot of Bash, C, and Perl is what we did.
And then from that ISP job, was that your first introduction into web development?
It was. In fact, I had a fantastic opportunity to build one of the first e-commerce sites on the internet. It's hard to know exact numbers. The internet was so small back then, but we built a website to sell luggage for one of the largest luggage companies, and worked on the first Slim Jim website, which wasn't e-commerce, but it was pretty fun. Got to participate with Macho Man Randy Savage, photo shoots and stuff. And so it was just kind of fun to be at the beginning of things. And this is back when it was HTML 2.0. So we were really excited for all the new tags that would come out and really empower us to do more. A lot of empty GIFs were used at the time. But yeah.
I'm struggling to imagine an e-commerce world without something like Stripe were you dealing with credit cards directly, or yeah, how does that even work?
Yeah, there wasn't gateways yet.
Mm.
And like Stripe's an evolution of gateways that kind of started with companies like authorize.net. But we really, it was just the very beginning of payment processing like that. And beginning of things like SSL. It was all very early.
During that time do you remember development with HTML or CSS that kind of blew you away, and it was incredible?
To be honest, no. Right, JavaScript wasn't really a thing yet, and if it was a thing, it wasn't fondly looked on thing. And and it kind of, JavaScript went through a really interesting evolution over the next 20 years. But 30 years, man, almost 30 years. But yeah, at that time, it was just the incredible thing was that you could do anything. The fact that you could create something that people across the world could access was the incredible portion. The tools were very rudimentary. The styles were rudimentary. Like you go down, the archive websites, you can see, early versions of things. Nothing was impressive. It had a very distinct look to it. Of course, resolutions were really low on all the monitors too. And but the fact that the internet itself was the amazing thing, that you could create something that someone across the world could access, was just incredible.
Yeah. And at the time, what was your vision of what the internet could become? Could you see a path to where we are now?
Oh, no. The speeds were so slow. The technology was so rudimentary at the time. Well, actually, in some regards, yes, and in some regards, no. The fact that the internet is so pervasive and on all these devices, I don't think anyone really foresaw that happening.
Yeah.
At the same time, the building blocks of what people do haven't changed. Like I think, if you look at the early days of AOL, all we've done is recreate that over and over again, right? And even AOL was recreating things that existed, news groups and IRC and different things. It keeps repackaging. Humans like to interact in similar ways, and Reddit is just a nicer version of things that happened before it. Slack is just a nicer version of, ultimately goes back to IRC. And so like we kind of did foresee some of these things, but it certainly is taken a massively different shape than anyone expected. And of course, the technologies involved have gone beyond anyone's expectations, I think, in terms of scale, in terms of how easy it is to get things, deployed to millions of people. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So after your job at the ISP, what comes after that?
So after that, I did college, and I actually majored in philosophy, because I felt like, for me, I really wanted to learn as much as I could at college. And I had already done so much in computers that I didn't feel like I was learning as much as I should have. Although I think if I stuck with the program, I probably would have discovered I was wrong with that. But I don't regret what I did. I also don't recommend doing what I did. But my alternative education in this industry has actually kind of set me apart, and I'm grateful for that. So I did that, and then it was a series of startups back in New York City. The first one was a social network focused around sports called Tackle. And then I had a series of, really, the next few jobs were social networks and e-commerce companies, kind of TikToking back and forth. And the last of them was a company called OpenSky. And there it was an e-commerce company. And we were, at that point, I'd built a few e-commerce companies and kind of was familiar with the challenges of doing that, and recognized that relational databases really struggled to model products, e-commerce products. and was looking for a better solution and stumbled onto MongoDB. And it was very, very, very early, like way before 1.0. And as I started using it, I became very impressed with it. We ended up adopting it, becoming one of the, I think the first e-commerce site and one of the first maybe 4 or 5 sites to use it. And through that, I developed a relationship with the founders of the company, and that led to joining them, which was still very early on when I did that. And then you've kind of highlighted the rest of the journey from there already. So,
yeah, and so let's move on to Jekyll. So before Jekyll, what are you using, and what did you replace that with for Hugo?
So I skipped a part of my story. I guess I should highlight that now. So when I was in college, I started a company called SuperNerd, and we ended up building closed source, right? Open source. I hadn't quite figured out how to do open source right yet. So we built a closed source CMS called SuperSite. And it was used by Major League Soccer. It was used by Priceline's affiliate engine, or their first white label engine. It was used by a lot of different kind of smaller companies. We had, hundreds of small customers. And so I that was built, by the way, in PHP and MySQL back in 2002 or 3, and it had some really innovative features, some of which would still be considered innovative. I used that for a long time to power my website personally. I ended up, for longer reasons than we have time to delve into, moving on to the path that I already shared with you. Eventually, I started using Drupal and WordPress for my personal site. First Drupal and then WordPress, and I became very familiar with both, having developed, contributing to modules and different components to them. And it ultimately, with WordPress was the final dynamic engine I used. I realized I was spending more time doing updates to it than I was spending, like security updates, than I was actually spending writing content. I also realized none of my content was dynamic. So why am I paying all this money for, and wasting all this energy for rendering dynamic content that's not? It's, static content in a dynamic fashion. And so that path led me to consider the static engines that were out there and explore them. And Jekyll was one of the ones I used. I actually used several of the ones that were existing at the time. And each of them had, in my opinion, severe limitations. And so I won't speak to each of them individually, but I'll speak to Jekyll as you brought that one up. For Jekyll, I struggled with really 2 major things. First was installing Jekyll meant installing everything that comes with Ruby, and making sure that you have all those dependencies right. And that took me, I guess for some people they get it right in the first try, but for me, I was into it hours.
Yeah.
And still struggling. And then once I finally got that all installed, I tried porting my blog, which again was a WordPress blog, and they had some sort of scripts, someone wrote a script to kind of export it from WordPress into the Jekyll format. So then I went to build the site, and it had, I don't know, maybe 200 posts in it, and it took 5 minutes. And I thought, this is unreal. Like, how can you, this is way, it's like compiling a program just to build your website, like, a big C++ program, like 5 minutes. And so I was playing around with theming, and CSS at the time was kind of evolving into CSS3. And so I was trying to really understand that better. So I was trying to play with the different techniques. I'd make changes to some templates, and then I'd, render to see the result of that 5 minutes later. I thought, this is ridiculous. So I'm searching. I was like, this is popular. Someone's got to solve this. And talking to people, and they're like, oh, we just wrote a rake script that removes all of your posts but one, and then renders it. And then it's 10 seconds, 15 seconds. I'm like, but that's absurd. Like, why would I want to take everything out? And so that led to the realization that what I needed didn't exist yet. What I
Mm,
thought I needed didn't exist. And at the same time, I was looking for a project to learn Go with. And so I thought, well, I wonder if this is the project.
mm. And what,
And
yeah, what was, did you have any experience with Go at the time?
no, I had, at the same time, I guess, kind of in parallel, this is back when I was at MongoDB. So my job there was leading the developer experience, which included integrations with things like Storm and Spark and Azure, and also included all of the client libraries, or we called them drivers, but people nowadays more call them client libraries, to integrate with every single programming language. And that was a real challenge because every language is very different with different idioms, and even different architecture. We handled multi-threaded languages, very different than how you'd handle single-threaded languages. And so, part of that was getting to know these languages, hiring experts in each of them, which we had a fantastic team at MongoDB. And the two, so I think we had, if I remember right, 12 languages that we were working with, or 10, and there was two more that were kind of up and coming that we decided to add, and it was Scala and Go. And I spent a few months trying to learn each of them. And I took Martin's class on Scala, which I thought was fantastic. And then after that, I started playing with Go. And so we were exploring a driver with that, and I started playing with it. But that was all in parallel to Hugo. So those really happened at the same time.
Got it. And that, while you were building Hugo while you were learning Go, did you have to go back and rewrite a lot of that original source code?
People did. I don't know that I rewrote much of it. The nice thing about open source is, with lots of contributions, a lot of the code gets improved. I would say a lot of it, it certainly had warts. I'll also say at the time, Go was very new. And there was a lot of everyone figuring it, including the Go team.
Yeah.
I remember Rob Pike, if you're not familiar, one of the three founders of Go, saying, around the same time that this was happening, he said, we've now designed the language. Now it's time for us to learn how to use it and us to really learn what Go is. And they did. They spent the next 5 years learning what Go is, and how it really works. And so I think there was a lot of learning at the time broadly. At the time, there was very few libraries that existed for Go, which is why I wrote so many of them, because I wanted things to work a certain way. And I would love to have libraries had already existed, but they didn't yet. And it would have been, there was not a lot of documentation. Most of what I learned from reading the standard library. So, I think there were definitely warts, but part of it were kind of communal warts that we all had as we were learning how to write Go better. So my timing was kind of the same as the Go community. Like, we all kind of learned together.
And it must have been one of the first big Go projects, or a well-known one at the time.
It was, I think it and Docker and Kubernetes were like the three big ones early on, and still actually three of the biggest open source projects in Go. So yeah, it was one of the earliest projects.
At that early stage, what was your ambition for Hugo? Was it simply a project to learn Go, or did you see it taking on Jekyll at the time?
So I thought my ambition was not to take on Jekyll. My ambition was much smaller. My ambition was, look, if I can build a project that powers my blog, I'll be pretty happy. If I can do that. If it can help other people, I'll be ecstatic. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine it taking off. Although there was a certain point in the development where I realized I think there's something here.
Mm.
But it wasn't, certainly wasn't at the outset. And it kind of took on a life of its own a few months into the project, where it became apparent, like, well, this is pretty capable. This can do a lot more than just power Steve's blog.
Mm.
And I, at MongoDB and at Docker, I both led our documentation teams, and I was familiar with some of the problems we had with documentation and or the challenges we had with documentation of the systems then. And I, part of that was in the back of my mind too, is that this is powerful enough. It could not just power a blog. It could power, a few thousand page documentation site. And it has gone on to do that. So, there was a lot of kind of random experiences from across the internet that all went into Hugo, dating back to the early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, Hugo seems to be the tool of choice for technical writers. If it's not a documentation specific static site generator, it's almost certainly Hugo, probably with the Doxy theme. That's got a life of its own as well.
Yeah.
Which is really cool to see play out. Where did the name Hugo come from?
It's a great question. I don't have a concrete answer, although I'd like to give you one. I honestly, for all of my projects, I know naming is a really important thing for adoption. So I spent a long time actually thinking about the name for this website platform, and there was a lot of different ideas floating around. Kind of like naming your children, right? There was just like a lot of different, I had lists of different things that I was thinking on, and one of the names was Hugo, and part for me is the author of Les Mis is Victor Hugo, and I was thinking of a literary theme. I'm also a huge Batman fan, so Victor Hugo is another theme there, and I just kept coming back to it. So those were two of the inspirations for it, but it just kind of kept feeling right. It was like short and somewhat descriptive, and it kind of felt literary and old a bit, but also fresh. It just kind of felt right, and it was frankly way better than any of the other names I came up with. So yeah, that's kind of the genesis of it. It just kind of felt right.
I personally very appreciate the name highly. When I talk, especially with the New Zealand accent, when I say Jekyll, no one understands me. Hugo's hard to mess up. So what was the response when you first announced and launched Hugo?
It was actually pretty small at the beginning. It really grew very organically over time. By the time I launched it, I was already using it and developing it for several months before I put it as open source. Frankly, my first Go project, a little sheepish to get it out there. But once I pushed it to the public, I realized there was something here, and the fact that it could build things so quickly, I thought was a huge advantage it had over other things at the time. So I thought it was pretty meaningful. But the initial reception was quiet. Like, I don't think people realized yet the value of that. A lot of people were a lot of static site generator users were so used to spending minutes to generate things that they didn't see the advantage of really short build times. But over the next probably 12 months, people started seeing that advantage, and that small loop time and the easy installation, I think, was another thing that really started moving people forward to it. And then as we started rounding out our feature set, it became more appealing to people. They had less of a reason to not try it. And so it, really over the first year, it really kind of very slowly picked up speed. And then we saw, really it took off after that. It really started increasing really quickly, and it was kind of fun to watch how its growth passed all of the static site generators that existed before it. And then there was it and Jekyll that were the top two for a while, and it eventually passed Jekyll, and that was a huge milestone for the project.
I want to drill into that question in a little bit, but first I want to ask, those early users, who were they and what were they using Hugo for?
Oh, it's a good question. Frankly, I don't know who most of them were. Right? It's open source. Anyone could download it. No one registered to do it. But I can say some of the more ones that I first came across my purview and I thought were pretty interesting. One of them was vote.gov, U.S. government website that was viewed by, I don't know, hundreds of millions of people. Maybe it was a really big website, very material website. I know who the early contributors were. Of course, you can look in our Git logs and see who are the early contributors too. And I don't want to name names for sake of missing an influential person, but I think there was a good number of people that were like me, looking to use it for their personal blog, and and interested in contributing. And then we started to see some really interesting things that, because of Hugo's power and speed, you could do things with it that you could never do with static site generator before. And so I remember one person, they put in the issue tracker in the forum, they talk about, I'm having trouble. I'm trying to generate, something like 100,000 pages. And we were like, and they were like hitting some edge cases because we never thought, 100,000 pages, something like that. But they were doing some e-commerce type thing, and just generating an enormous amount of pages. And so we started experimenting how to improve it to be able to handle bigger workloads like that. And of course that led to improvements across everything. But it was really interesting to see how all the different companies that, many of which I was fans of their products, and now they're using Hugo, and for years, and I still do this now, I'll email Bjorn whenever a new one comes across my, and with my role in the Go team, sometimes that happens more often. I'll email, oh, this new site came up online, it's using Hugo, isn't that exciting? And from major corporations to like really cool projects, it's just, I remember lots of like Linux related projects started using it for their documentation. And man, it came like full circle for me, because I started in the early 90s with FreeBSD and Linux, and here it comes full circle that they're now using something that I created. It just felt pretty great.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you remember with all of those use cases? Let's drill into the 100,000 page edge cases. Like where was Hugo falling over? I'm just curious. Was it like memory management or?
Oh, you're testing my memory too much on that one. This is probably like 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
That we were doing that, and actually Bjorn handled most of that, so he'd be the better person to ask. Hopefully next time you have this conference he can participate. He's certainly, I can definitely speak better to the beginnings of Hugo, as I was there from day one, but he can certainly speak better to the currents of Hugo, and he's been driving the project for years.
Got it. I'll leave that one for Bjorn. So let's talk about that. How did Bjorn come into the project?
Honestly, it's pretty miraculous. He took in, so with open source, you're always hoping for the right contributors to come. Someone that really takes an interest in the project, wants to take it in a similar direction to where you're taking it, and invest the time and effort to learning it. We were fortunate to have a handful of those with this project. But when Bjorn got involved, it was clear he brought a lot of expertise, not with Go, but with programming. He actually, I think, learned Go on Hugo, same as I did. But he had a lot of very deep in the stack experience. And brought a lot of that to Hugo. So a lot of performance. He really started at the beginning on performance things. And then as he got more and more involved, he kept giving more and more patches. And a long time ago, I realized that I was hindering the progression of my projects by
Mm,
keeping too kind of tight of a grip on them. And so I was at this time I was like trying to experiment to saying like anyone who asks to get involved, anyone who asks for like committer rights, I'm just going to give it to them and
mm,
see what happens. And I'm not sure that's the right approach, but it worked. It worked on this. It worked on Cobra. Um, and the kind of theory is when people want to get involved, they're usually willing to put the effort in to learn to do the right things. And that's turned out to be largely true.
mm.
And so it worked really well. And he just kind of you know he showed up and just kept contributing more and more meaningful things. And eventually it was very clear that he was spending more time on Hugo than I was. And around that same time, I was joining the Go team and was nowhere near going to be able to have the same amount of time to put onto it that he was, and he wanted to. And so it was really natural to hand it over. It wasn't like even a strong handover. It was more like he just kept doing more and more, and I kept doing less and less. And eventually it became clear that, he should own it in terms of the direction and everything. And so he just kept doing that. And he's not a shy person either, so he was fine with stepping into that role. And then I helped him with a lot of the, like I helped him get sponsorship for the project and try and ensure its longevity. But he's been driving the technical direction now for, I don't know, at least 5 years,
Mm.
and doing a great job with that.
It certainly is. Yeah, agreed. What were when you released Hugo, what was the most kind of surprising feature requests or things that you hadn't thought of in those early days?
I'll answer a different question. Honestly, I don't remember a surprising feature request, but I do remember delightful. I'll change the
Mm.
term a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
Delightful pull request that came in, and it was back in my background from working with technical writing systems. I came to understand the need for good multilingual internationalization support,
Mm.
and I also knew that I did not know enough to do that. So it was something that I had wanted to do from the very beginning, but I knew it was a tremendous amount of work that required a lot of experience from someone that was multilingual and multicultural. And we got a fantastic, just one day, someone came up and issued this pull request to give multilingual support pretty early into the days of Hugo. And it was great. Like worked really well. And this was in the days when Bjorn was getting more and more involved, and he's multilingual as well. And so him being around to be able to validate and improve it too was just lots of luck with that. But frankly, I think it's one of our strongest features,
Yeah.
the ability to support that natively, and in a really pretty seamless way. And we took inspiration from others that had tread down that path before, but I love the approach that Hugo takes there. And it's unlocked lots of doors for documentation sites and other websites. A lot of companies are using it specifically because of that support.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the first SSG to really bake that in and not to be some sort of extension afterthought.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hugo's structure in general is quite different from certainly any SSG at the time. What made you, I feel like it really puts an emphasis on separating content from structure. Was that a strong philosophy that you had from the start, and where did that come from?
Yes, it was a very strong philosophy from the start. And the inspiration came from a lot of places. Some from the super site that I built, decades ago. Some from Drupal. I think Drupal's approach to the way they layer in things. So like Hugo has a great thing where you can kind of overload theme templates with your own layout ones. The inspiration for that came right from Drupal. Drupal does something very similar to that. Yeah, there's lots of inspiration kind of from different places, and so I don't know how many original ideas there are in Hugo, But and then part of it was just trying to build something that felt right for the paradigm. And
Mm,
so it's kind of like, mixing in ideas that had happened before, and then trying to make it as smooth as possible. This is something I actually don't think anyone knows. But when I built Hugo, I actually started with the command line first, and I
mm,
by that I mean, um, like I started prototyping what Hugo, you know, build would do, or whatever it is. Like Hugo knew, I started building out that step first. I actually
mm,
went from the user experience backwards, um, and then built it up. And that's one of the reasons I built Cobra, is because I already knew what I wanted the user experience to feel like, and nothing did it at the time. And so I was like, all right, well, sounds like it's time to build a framework that supports this exact way of doing things. And so a lot of this was kind of working backwards from the experience that I thought needed to happen, and then building whatever tooling needed to be to support that experience.
mm. And you mentioned taking that separation of content from Drupal. Was there any other ideas from this static site generators that existed that you thought were really strong and brought that into Hugo purposely?
Uh, at this point, honestly, I can't remember the exact things, but I remember there's, I played with Pelican, Jekyll. There was certainly inspiration from a lot of them out there. There's Sphinx was a documentation
Mm-hmm.
engine that took some inspiration from that. There was a lot. I spent a good amount of time studying the things that first I had a lot of experience with them a lot before I came in, and then spent time studying the ones I didn't have a lot of experience with and trying to learn from them. But I couldn't tell you exactly which features came from which place, but I certainly those all the ones I mentioned and many more were served as inspiration points.
Mm. Yeah, that's asking questions from many years ago. Um, so in the late 90s, the web moves more and more dynamic. Everyone starts using WordPress and Drupal and these dynamic systems. And it feels like at one point in the late 2000s, everyone remembers about static again. And if you look at maybe the past 10 years as well, it feels like we're going on the same journey. Like, what do you think contributes to this flip-flopping between static, dynamic?
So it's a good question. I actually think so. So initially, the web was all static, right? Like that's all there was, and that there was a definitive need for dynamic content as people wanted to build things that were personalized. And e-commerce, I think, drove a lot of that, right?
Mm,
E-commerce really needed some personalization, at least to some of the pages. It was important to show if something was in stock or out of stock, and of course, shopping carts needed to be dynamically done. And so, there was a need to have dynamic content, and then social media kind of took off with MySpace and others, and there was a need for dynamic content as part of that too. Um, and then there became a realization that we kind of overcorrected, and we were using dynamic engines for static content, and it wasn't a good fit. And so, because it turned out that not all content was dynamic, right? And so the pendulum just swung too far to that extreme, and so as it kind of righted itself a bit. I think with the resurgence that happened around the time of Jekyll and Hugo, though, it wasn't. I don't think we overcompensated there. It's not like they displaced WordPress. Still,
mm,
what is it? Something over 40% of the internet, something like that, is running on WordPress. So clearly, there's still a strong pull towards dynamic engines, but it was the recognition that not all not that's not the right tool for every job,
mhm,
and so we kind of had a resurgence with the recognition that can be a better tool for this job with alternatives. And lately we're seeing even more alternatives. I think things like Next.js, which is a bit of a hybrid. It's
Mhm.
really, I wouldn't, sometimes people loop it in with static site engines, but it's not. It's not a static site engine. It's a dynamic engine and a static site engine. It's a hybrid. And I
Mm.
think it's the next evolution that realizes that, sometimes you're going to have a mix of the two things. And, I think there's a lot of power to that too. It's just a new style of tool for a new need that
Mm.
emerges. And I've seen, since it's a Hugo conference, and I've seen people build. One of the nice things about Go is it ships with its own web server. And one of the things I've seen lots of companies do is they either put Caddy or just their own Go server in front of Hugo. They still serve the content that Hugo presents, and they kind of build their own hybrid engine in
Mm.
the same vein as what Next.js does, but letting Hugo run the static side. And I think there's a lot of power to that too. Um, so I think there's, as time continues, we're going to see more and more solutions emerge to attach to specific use cases that people have. But I'm excited to see how it's all going, and I'm excited to see how serverless and the edge caching and everything are going to fit into this too.
Mm. And how do you think that Hugo stays relevant, or does it need to stay relevant against all these new frameworks that are coming out?
I think I, so. One of the nice things about an open source project like this is it has taken on a life of its own. Our users take it to new places that neither I nor Bjorn would ever dream it would go. And I think that's how it stays relevant. It's things like this conference ensure its relevancy. Things like I was looking at all the new ideas and the new CMS front ends and different things that are coming out around Hugo. These are all things that will keep it relevant. But I think as long as Hugo has, Hugo occupies a pretty distinct place within this spectrum of things. And as long as that matches a need that users have, and I can't imagine it won't, then I think Hugo will continue to stay relevant. And I'm excited to see all the different directions people are going to take it and which ones are going to get traction. And but it's really exciting every time. I wish I vlogged more often than I do, but it feels like every time I write a new blog post, there's new toys and features and different things to play with. So it's exciting.
We're almost out of time. I could ask you questions all day, but I want to finish off with two last questions. Something you referenced earlier is that Hugo, the GitHub stars, the trajectory has been amazing, and it's been passing all the other SSGs and recently passed Jekyll. Why do you think that is? What's happening? What's so special about Hugo that it's able to do that?
So I think GitHub stars is a nice vanity metric, right? It's something everyone can see, but also is it's pretty cheap, right? Like just because someone starts something doesn't actually have any meaning to it, really.
Yeah.
So I think it's neat to see that, and it's an easy measurement to look at. And of course, it's been fantastic to see the popularity. I think that's a good popularity metric. But I think more important is actually to see sites running Hugo. And with that, that's also taken off in a similar vein, to the point where it's the most popular site generator out there, and has been for several years now. And I think the reason for this is that Hugo, pretty much everything you can do with the other static site generators, you could also do in Hugo, but there's a lot of things that you can only do in Hugo. Right. And there's a lot of use cases because of some of our unique feature sets of being able to do multilingual natively, being able to, build such a huge thing, our data layers, the way that you can, in a large sense, you can almost use Hugo as kind of as a dynamic engine with caching, in that it has these great data bindings that can request dynamic content and then build static cached versions of that dynamic content. And because Hugo is so fast to build, it can do that, every few minutes, and it'll feel relatively fresh. So there's a lot of things that you can do in Hugo that you couldn't dream of doing with any of the other static site engines. And so I think that's a big part of it is people, there's a large set of use cases that could never have considered static site engines before and can now thanks to Hugo. And Hugo unlocking those has really propelled its popularity. And of course, there's a bit of a momentum effect that happens that if you're using it for this more complicated thing, it's also nice to use it for this simple thing that, Jekyll or Pelican or whatever would have worked fine for. But now that Hugo's got the momentum, it becomes more of the default.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, last question. Do you have any message for the Hugo community?
Yes, I am blown away that there is a Hugo community. I'm so glad that you're here and part of this. It's really, it's very heartwarming to see the success that Hugo's taken off on and the effort that all of you put into it, and how your enthusiasm around it. It's just it's really mind blowing that it's taken on this life of its own, and I'm just incredibly grateful for all of you and for what you've done.
Great way to end it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve.